When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about how Maegor saved the Targaryen dynasty. And specifically, I want to talk about how Maegor just doesn't really get a lot of credit in terms of how good and beneficial his actions were to the Targaryen dynasty. Even if you think about the history books, the way that he's like seen by Targaryens and even the common people, they look at him as this dictator, one of the worst Targaryen kings of all time. That just simply is not true, in my opinion. Yes, Maegor did some bad things in terms of cruelties or going too far into the extreme, but he did a lot of things right if you're taking it from the Targaryen point of view, not the common person, right? If I was a common person, I also wouldn't like Maegor much. But if you're looking at it from somebody that is trying to say, okay, how did he allow the Targaryens to continue ruling for a very long time? Maegor is vital in that. And so in this video, we're going to go over some of the issues and why kind of the Targaryen dynasty was on the edge of a knife and why it almost collapsed. And we'll talk about some of his, and then we'll talk about some of Maegor's actions that led to, you know, where we are with, like, for instance, Jaehaerys's rule, why Maegor set up that reign to be so successful. But before we do get into the video, I want to say a massive thank you to my Patreons and YouTube members. Thank you for supporting this channel. Also, if you did want to become one, you do get videos early and also an exclusive video each week. So let's get into it. Now, to really think about what was going on during this time. During the time of Aenys' rule, I would say specifically, the faith and the maesters and really Old Town as a whole was kind of at its most powerful. You could argue, like, also during the dance, because the High Towers are directly on the throne. But I'm talking about more of a sense of how much influence Old Town had over the rest of the world, right? Everyone was invested behind the faith of the Seven. They held complete sway over what actions people would do and how they reacted to, like, for instance, Targaryen kings. And so all of that kind of started with Aegon's conquest. Now, if you think about how Aegon eventually takes over the kingdoms, the High Tower itself in Old Town doesn't really, like, support Aegon until the very last chance when they open their gates. And so Aegon is already seen as someone that, yes, they don't want to bow to him, of course, and he goes against the faith of the Seven because Aegon has two wives. They're also his sisters. It's kind of incesty. But in that situation, they realize, okay, there's no point of us all dying. You know, we're just gonna have to wait till there's another king. And so Aegon dies, and during Aegon's reign, he doesn't really do much to weaken the faith's power and sway over the kingdoms, right? Because we don't see really any of that happen until after Aegon's death. Even when Visenya is still alive, the faith start to press their advantage. They start to see how much they can get away with, dictating who should marry who within the Targaryen family. They don't want Maegor, for instance, to marry Rhaena, who is Aegon's wife. That is, again, the first child of Aenys. So the two end up, by the way, marrying, but that's not the point, right? At the time, it was very normal for the custom to be Targaryens to marry Targaryens, but because Aegon wasn't really there anymore, and that they saw they could get away with it and turn the public against the Targaryens if they did these bad decisions, okay, so they get to this point where Aenys is somebody that just was completely indecisive. He didn't take action at all. He was almost the complete opposite of Aegon in every single way, which is interesting given that Aegon the Conqueror was somebody that was very stoic. He was very decisive, a great military leader, and just a good king overall. Aenys was the one being groomed for rule, but yet he possesses none of those qualities. And don't get me wrong, I think Aenys is a really good guy, probably, if you were just gonna have like a drink with or something, but not a good king, right? Good person, not a good king. And so Aenys, during his entire reign, constantly is having rebellions that either Maegor has to put down, or rebellions that just continue to fester until Maegor comes back from Pentos and Essos and is able to then solve those issues that Aenys left on his deathbed. And so when you think about the situation that was brewing and leading up into Maegor taking the throne, you had the Faith, which was exercising its power even more. They were basically thwarting anything Aenys was trying to do in terms of marriages with the Targaryens and, you know, marrying his daughter and his son together, Aegon and Rhaena, who then get trapped. This part of history when Maegor actually ends up coming over. And so you have a really big issue, right? Because you have the heir to the throne, Aegon, is besieged at Crakehall with his sister wife, Rhaena. Okay, that's bad right away. And so you're sitting here and you're going, the Faith could have easily taken the Targaryens off the throne if it wasn't for Maegor and Visenya. And so what happens next, right? After all this rebellion's going on, the country is in chaos. Aenys himself has to flee King's Landing. He ends up dying on Dragonstone. The Targaryen power is almost completely crippled. That's if, say, you know, Visenya had died earlier on and maybe she wasn't there to retrieve Maegor, and Maegor was just in exile for the rest of his life. I think it's very likely the Targaryen dynasty would have failed right here and then. But it doesn't. Thankfully, Visenya, because again, she was somebody that worked for her, you know, Aegon and all this to establish their family. And maybe she knew about Aegon's dream, if we're going to go that route. She knew what needed to be done. And if she was watching Aenys and his children more or less just screw it all up, destroy what Aegon, you know, Rhaenys and her all built. And so Maegor comes over and instantly takes charge, right? He's anointed as a king on Dragonstone. He goes to King's Landing and he wins a trial by 7. And that should, if we're still going off of the Faith, that should dictate that the gods favored that Maegor should be king. But the Faith once again manipulated. If Faith is something in A Song of Ice and Fire, which is, it's very divisive because people interpret their faith very differently. And so Maegor comes in and he burns the Sept of Remembrance on Rhaenys Hill, killing anybody that comes out. He's making a statement. He puts into law this idea that anybody, you know, with the Faith should be disarmed, the warrior sons and all that stuff, they should be gone. He takes the fight to the Faith. He shows right here, right away, that the Faith are not dealing with an Aenys. They're dealing with the son of Aegon the Conqueror. Maybe he was more of, I would say, Visenya's son than he was Aegon's. He was going to deal with this issue, right? Maegor is one of those people that believes himself as more of a person than a normal human being. Think about House of the Dragon, the way they portray the dragons as being like gods. Maegor's trying to reestablish that precedent, right? That these laws that you have, right, that the Faith have, do not apply to the Targaryens, right? Because we have dragons, because we are from old Valyria, all that stuff. And so he takes the complete opposite approach that Aenys does. Aenys lets it fester, he gives them more, and they just want more. Maegor is not that way. Maegor is going to put them down. And so he takes the war to them, winning a battle at Stonebridge and later a battle at the Great Fork of the Blackwater. Maegor personally fought in, you know, that battle as well and using Balerion. If this had not occurred, right, if Maegor had not taken the initiative to put the Faith in their own place, right? That they are not, you know, equal with the king or the ruling family, that would have taken a huge toll on Jaehaerys when he tries to rule later on. Because think about the way Jaehaerys walks into the throne. The Faith is all but depleted, destroyed because of Maegor. Maegor's put into effect a law that they can't arm themselves, something that Jaehaerys is just not going to repeal. He understands the wisdom in it. And he walks into a fractured kingdom that's been completely weakened by Maegor's rule. Because in a lot of ways, Jaehaerys' position was not necessarily easy, but if you look at the position Aenys and Maegor were both put into, his position was quite easy, right? Fix up those ties with the Faith, but at the same time uphold the laws put by Maegor, but at least make some connection, make them feel a bit more valuable, even if they're not. They've lost all their influence. Not all of it, but they've lost a good amount of influence. Maegor does a lot right in this. And yes, you can say, oh, well, he kills Aenys' son Aegon and all that stuff. But at the same time, Aegon was leading an army and trying to fight Maegor for the throne. Maegor was not the person that was going to fight Aegon, and so it was going to happen one way or another. If Aegon is coming to kill you, as if you're Maegor, what is your response going to be? Especially if you're someone that believes you are a higher being. I don't really blame Maegor for, one, taking the throne because of the weakness that has been shown by his brother Aenys and kind of his line as well. Right? His line is, being kept up while the realm is bleeding and being split. And so I don't blame Maegor for taking the throne. 2, I don't blame Maegor for having to go into this battle and inevitably have to kill Aegon, because that is somebody that was trying to take the throne from Maegor. Maybe Maegor should have, bent the knee to Aegon. But if you're Maegor, why would you? You're the one that did all the work to help bring the kingdoms back together. Remember, many people actually supported Maegor as well, until he started getting more cruel. It's really after Visenya dies is when Maegor's reign falls apart, because Visenya is very wise. Regardless of what you think about Visenya, she's someone that had a lot of wisdom. She was able to maybe corral some of Maegor's impulses and all those things. If you want to think about it, I think the best comparison is a little different, because like in the show for Game of Thrones or even the book, Marjorie manipulating Joffrey is more like a husband-wife thing, where this is like, think about Marjorie as like a mother to Maegor. That's kind of how that relationships works, where like Visenya was able, I think, to really talk down Maegor on a lot of things and kind of control him a bit more to make smart decisions, right? She knew how to conquer and to rule. She's been doing it her entire life. And so I think one of the things that gets overlooked is Jaehaerys, how he just walks into a kingdom that, yes, it might be bleeding, it might be hurt, but it's not too difficult to kind of repair all those gaps, right? Because again, Jaehaerys has a dragon still, so he still commands that power over people to where he doesn't have to do what Maegor does, right? Maegor, because of Aenys' rule and Aegon's rule, Maegor has to show his strength. He has to prove that his threats mean something. And so when Jaehaerys comes to the throne right after him, people already know that, right? They know what Jaehaerys could possibly do to them because of what Maegor does to the faith and all these things leading up to the war. And so in a lot of ways, in my opinion, regardless of what you think about Maegor, especially later on in his life, right after Visenya dies, he paved the way for everything that was going to work with Jaehaerys' reign, right? This long peace, because a lot of people will remember what happened during the time of Maegor and how Maegor had to use Balerion to make the country come together, because the faith had divided the country. The faith was turning people against the crown and breaking that system. And regardless of what you think of, the system of kings and all of that, but if you're looking at it from a Targaryen perspective, Maegor did everything right, in my opinion, until he gets to after he kind of deals with the faith. Once it kind of all starts to settle down, Maegor then does some pretty not great stuff. And part of it is insecurity, right? Part of it is, okay, he can't have any kids, and so he blames it on all the women. He doesn't blame it on himself, and right? And that's something I think that's very human, right? And so I paint Maegor as more of a human than I think a lot of people do, right? I think a lot of people, especially even Song of Ice and Fire YouTubers, they think of Maegor as just this cruel guy that had no real human emotion. He was somebody that proves that he did have human emotion and reacted to things how I think a lot of people would. But to me, when you get to kind of his downfall, who is left to oppose Jaehaerys, right? Jaehaerys just walks into the throne room, right? Has no one to oppose him, and Maegor has basically taken out all of his enemies and or weakened them severely so that if they did step out of line, it'd be easy for Jaehaerys to deal with them. And that's not to take away from Jaehaerys being a great king, because him and Alysanne were fantastic rulers. But I do want to push back on this idea that, they brought the kingdoms together. They took the remnants of what Maegor did right and fixed what he did wrong, is more or less what ends up happening. And so if a lot of the Targaryen kings, I think a lot of Targaryen kings, Jaehaerys had one of the easier ways of establishing his rulership. Now, not to say the easiest. I think Viserys had a pretty easy position after taking over from Jaehaerys. I think there's some other ones if you want to look at, kings during the Targaryen rulership. But to me, the main point of this video is to really show that Maegor's actions were necessary and needed to get to the Targaryen dynasty in a more cemented place, to have that long stretch of peace before we inevitably get to another war, which, coincidentally enough, also is dealing with more or less the faith, the Hightowers. And also think about Maegor's first queen was a Hightower. It goes and ties into my whole theory about the Hightowers and Old Town and the Maesters and the Septons, the faith, all that plays into a lot of that. It's just a little too convenient that two of the main conflicts in the first 100 years of the Targaryen rule stem straight from Old Town. It's a little suspicious. But thank you guys all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.